The summer of 1942 lay heavy and golden over Waverly Creek, Ohio, a town where the loudest sound was usually the hum of cicadas or the low whistle of the 315 freight train. Life moved at the pace of the general store's ticking clock. For Eleanor Hayes, this routine was both a comfort and a quiet cage. She was 22, sharp and stifled. Her days were spent balancing ledgers for Mr. Henderson at the bank, her nights tracing patterns on the ceiling, dreaming of a world larger than the county line. The war, a beast roaring across oceans, felt like a distant, terrible play. The young men had left, of course, boys she danced with now appearing as grainy photos in the weekly paper, their faces a little harder, a little more resolute. But the war hadn't truly arrived in Waverly Creek. Not until that Tuesday afternoon. It arrived with the sputtering of a government jeep in the crisp official uniform of the Western Union delivery boy, Jimmy Peterson, who usually only brought birthday greetings. "Eleanor," Jimmy stammered, handing her a pale yellow envelope. His eyes, usually full of boyish mischief, held a solemnity that belied his 16 years. It's important. Direct from Washington." The paper felt brittle under her fingers. Inside, the typewritten words were sparse, precise, and utterly shattering to the quiet routine she knew. "Report immediate. Washington classified personnel. New assignment location, Redwood. Transportation scheduled Thursday, 0600 hours. Failure to comply considered federal offense. Confidentiality paramount. Burn this upon memorization." A cold dread mixed with a thrilling spike of adrenaline. Redwood. She had vaguely heard whispers about a massive government-built complex far away, a place where the brightest minds and most capable hands were being funneled to build something. No one knew exactly what, but everyone knew it was vital. Eleanor didn't have an engineering degree or a political science background. She had simply scored exceptionally high on the federal clerical aptitude test a year ago, then promptly forgotten about it. She was just a methodical bank clerk. Yet the government, in its great, mysterious hunger for manpower, had found her. That evening, the familiar sense of her mother's apple pie and the sound of her father reading the evening news seemed unbearably loud. She couldn't tell them. The telegram, now ashes smoldering in the fireplace grate, had made that explicitly clear. "You look pale, Ellie," her mother observed, her brow furrowing. "Trouble at the bank?" "No, Mama, just a lot of numbers today." Eleanor managed a thin smile, the lie tasting like dust. She spent the night packing a single worn valise, not with frilly dresses or dance shoes, but with sturdy walking shoes, plain blouses, and a notebook. She looked at her reflection, the small-town girl, the quiet clerk. Tomorrow that girl would cease to exist. She was being erased, replaced by an asset of the state, heading into a mysterious classified world. The war's demands had finally reached out, plucked her from the comfort of Waverly Creek, and plunged her into the telegram's shadow. The journey had been a blur of rumbling train wheels and hushed conversations with the handful of other women who shared the sealed carriage. They were all young, all nervous, and all bound by the silence the government. For 3 weeks, Eleanor and her fellow units had been cogs in a colossal, confusing machine. They operated presses, checked gauges, and bundled finished metal parts, all without any clear understanding of the final product. Everything was labeled with cryptic alphanumerics: Component 117B, Subassembly Gamma, Unit 9X. The secrecy wasn't just official, it was baked into the very structure of their work. Then came the change. One morning, a team of male engineers, draped in spotless white lab coats, a stark contrast to the workers' greasy coveralls, arrived in Bay 4. They installed a new, smaller workstation and moved Eleanor, Maria, and June to it, separating them from the general flow. The engineer in charge, a nervous man named Dr. Finch, spoke softly, his voice barely cutting through the industrial din. "You three have demonstrated the highest precision scores. You are now designated Assembly Team Alpha. Your work will be different."
He didn't hand them a finished blueprint. Instead, he presented them with a series of intricately detailed schematics, each one covering only a fractional part of a larger design. The pieces they were now handling were unlike anything else in the factory. Delicate, complex, and made of specialized alloys that shimmered faintly under the harsh lights. "This is a pressure chamber," Dr. Finch explained, pointing to a diagram of interlocking rings. "It must withstand immense, fluctuating stress. No gaps, ladies. A tolerance of 0. As they began to assemble the components, tiny, perfectly milled gears, polished cylindrical casings, and thin, complicated wiring harnesses, Eleanor's methodical mind started piecing together the fragmented puzzle. She might not have the master blueprint, but she had the logic of the connections. "These rings," she murmured to Maria as they meticulously fused 2 sections, "they're too heavy for an airplane engine, and too precise for a tank gun." Maria, eyes focused intently on the solder, whispered back, "The way the wiring clusters, it looks like it's built to monitor itself. A brain, not a simple motor." June, the quietest of the 3, finally spoke, her voice steady. "They're building something that moves fast, and something that controls something else. Look at the insulation on this coil. It's designed to handle electrical output far beyond a standard signal." It wasn't until a week later, when Eleanor was assembling a shell casing that required a special ceramic heat shield, that the shocking truth began to coalesce. She remembered a hushed conversation overheard in the bank before she left Waverly Creek, a rumor about a secret new weapon, a way to end the war quickly and decisively. The final piece of the puzzle arrived as a section of the casing designed to house a highly volatile compound. It wasn't the compound itself, that would be added elsewhere, perhaps even later, but the container was built to manage the kind of immense directed energy that only existed in theory or in the terrifying new classified programs the government was running. Their work was not for a common piece of ordnance. They were assembling the critical inner workings of a highly classified new military technology, something that, if successful, would change warfare forever. Eleanor felt a thrill of terror. They weren't just rosies building bombers. They were the unseen architects of victory, building the very core of a weapon shrouded in such deep official secrecy that its existence was an act of deception against the world. They now held the secret so monumental.
Silence of the classified project and the common language of the factory floor. Their hidden pasts lay stacked alongside their uniforms, forming the foundation of a trust that was about to be severely tested. In the relentless, deafening environment of Redwood's Assembly Bay 4, official communication was strictly limited to technical instructions and security warnings barked over the public address system. The real news, however, traveled through a complex, silent infrastructure known only to the workers, the Whisper Network. It operated during the brief 10-minute breaks, in the rhythmic clinking of spoons in the mess hall, or in hushed tones over the sink in the washroom. It was gossip, yes, but it was also a vital flow of intelligence. Who was being moved to a different bay, which supervisor was on a power trip, and, most importantly, where the next critical bottleneck in production lay. For Eleanor, Maria, and June, now fully immersed in the delicate work of Team Alpha, the Whisper Network took on a chilling new significance. "Did you hear about Bay 7? A tired woman named Betty leaned in close to Eleanor, her eyes wide with fear during a coffee break. "They said a lathe operator. She lost 2 fingers. Machine jammed, they said." Eleanor nodded solemnly. But Betty pressed on, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible rasp. "But Margaret, from Bay 6, she saw the lathe's safety brake. Someone had wired it shut, clean off. It wasn't an accident, Eleanor. It was done." This was the core of the growing fear, the suspicion that not all accidents were accidental. Over the next few days, the network buzzed with similar unsettling stories. A batch of critical vacuum tubes, ready for final assembly, mysteriously shattered on a trolley. The wheel locks had been released at the top of a ramp. A shipment of specialized copper wiring was found deliberately contaminated with traces of a cheaper alloy, enough to cause catastrophic failure, but subtle enough to almost pass inspection. These incidents, individually, could be dismissed as industrial mishaps. Collectively, they painted a pattern of deliberate, calculated sabotage. The women of Redwood were patriots, working through exhaustion and danger, but now a new enemy was inside the walls, wearing the same uniform. Maria, whose family history made her acutely aware of surveillance, was the most wary. "They want us to doubt each other," she muttered, carefully calibrating her press. "The efficiency drops when we're scared. That's the real goal." June, meanwhile, began utilizing her quiet observation skills, gleaned perhaps from her former life. She watched the flow of security personnel, noticing which guards ignored certain areas and which ones lingered too long. She even started tracking the shift movements of certain maintenance men, whose access to all parts of the factory was far broader than the assembly workers. Eleanor, armed with her bank clerk's meticulous attention to detail, began cross-referencing the accident report she heard on the network with the official reports posted in the break room, reports which always downplayed the severity and always cited operator error. She noticed a disturbing correlation. The accident incidents seemed to cluster around the preparation of component 117B, the critical, highly classified section that Team Alpha was assembling. The factory floor, once a place of national purpose, now felt like a closed box where loyalty was impossible to verify. Eleanor felt the palpable atmosphere of fear squeezing the air from her lungs. The collective hope and purpose that had initially fueled the women was being replaced by suspicion and self-preservation. Mr. Thorne's oversight was not aimed at finding the saboteur, it was aimed at total control. He had turned the pressure of the war effort inward, transforming the women who were building the nation's victory into suspects under constant, agonizing watch. When the sun set over the fortified walls of Redwood, the factory didn't sleep, it shifted. The day crews, fueled by caffeine and the dwindling light, trudged out, replaced by the ghost economy of the night shift. This was the domain of the women, the most intense and often dangerous hours, where the factory ran on raw willpower and the sheer dread of falling behind. For Eleanor, Maria, and June, the night shift began at 6 p.m. and stretched toward the desolate light of 6 a.m. The heavy industrial air grew thick and cold, and the fluorescent lights of Bay 4 seemed to intensify, casting the machines in a harsh, unforgiving glare. This was the hour of the night shift, a 12-hour crucible where weariness battled speed. Around 2 a.m., the physical exhaustion became a cruel, mind-numbing force. Every repetitive motion, the press, the solder, the adjustment, required a conscious effort to overcome the body's desperate plea for rest. They battled the sleep blink, the tiny fleeting moment when an eye closed and the brain momentarily disengaged, a lapse that could cost a finger, or worse, ruin a week's worth of highly classified work. The pressure of the war effort peaked during these hours. The security was lighter, but the demand was higher. With a major delivery of the new military technology scheduled for the end of the week, the quotas for Assembly Team Alpha had been raised by 20%. 100 units of 117B by dawn, Dr. Finch had announced, his voice tight with anxiety. Failure was not an option. Eleanor's head throbbed, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, focused on the micro-solder, connecting wires thinner than human hair. The precision needed was impossible for a woman running on 4 hours of sleep, yet she achieved it. The fate of soldiers overseas, the very outcome of the war, felt as though it rested on her aching, trembling hands. Maria worked with a focused intensity that bordered on frenzy. She had discovered that pushing her body to the brink kept her mind from dwelling on the fear of Mr. Thorne's gaze or the distant reality of her family in the camps. She found a dark rhythm in the work, the click-whir of the press a substitute for thought. June, usually the most reserved, became fiercely practical.
When Eleanor's hands seized up from fatigue, June quickly poured a cup of lukewarm water and forced her to drink it, keeping watch for the nearby supervisor. When a complicated sequence of wiring diagrams briefly confused Maria, June instantly took over the bench, completing the task with practiced, clean movements. Their all-female night shift had developed its own rituals of survival. They shared small, hoarded rations of sugar and passed silent signals of encouragement across the benches. The anonymity and fear were still present, but in the deepest hours of the night, their collective struggle against exhaustion and the machine itself forged their bond tighter than any daytime camaraderie. Around 4 a.m., the true test arrived. The main power surged, then momentarily dropped, causing the high-precision laser.
Duty meant reporting the flaw, halting the entire assembly line, and bringing the full, terrifying attention of Mr. Thorne and his security apparatus down upon herself. It meant risking interrogation, suspicion, and possibly even the fate of Maria and June, who are standing right next to her. She glanced at the cold, unblinking eye of the surveillance camera overhead. Thorne would see her pause. He would see her hesitate. Maria, sensing Eleanor's sudden stillness, looked over. "Eleanor? What is it?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She took a deep breath, the oily metallic air filling her lungs. The foreign mark felt like a personal challenge. She looked at Maria, remembering her family in the camps, and at June, who had sacrificed her life of comfort. They weren't just building a weapon, they were defending a future. With a final, resolute nod, Eleanor carefully picked up the defective component and held it up for the camera to see. She had chosen duty. Eleanor's courageous decision to report the deliberately flawed regulator component had, as predicted, plunged Assembly Bay 4 into chaos. Mr. Thorne had descended with his guards, his face a mask of furious self-righteousness. The security chief had interrogated Eleanor for an hour, dismissing her story of a foreign trace as paranoia, but the component was too sensitive to ignore. The cylinder was confiscated, the entire batch quarantined, and the atmosphere on the floor became toxic with suspicion. Thorne, convinced the flaw originated within the plant, doubled down on surveillance. He saw Eleanor not as a hero, but as a liability, a worker who saw too much. The next day, as the factory hummed with renewed, frightened intensity, Eleanor felt utterly isolated. Maria and June could only offer sympathetic glances. Communication was too dangerous. During the mandatory, silent dinner break in the sterile mess hall, Eleanor sat alone, pushing the bland ration of meatloaf around her plate. As she opened her government-issued metal lunch pail to retrieve her thermos, her fingers brushed against something foreign. It wasn't food. It was a square of thin, folded paper tucked tightly beneath the lining of her pail. Someone, a friend or a complete stranger who had access to the tightly controlled dining area, had risked everything to pass her a message. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Under the unforgiving glare of the mess hall lights, with Thorne's lieutenants patrolling the aisles, reading it was nearly impossible. She waited until the last possible moment, shielding the paper with her hands while pretending to adjust her thermos. The note was not a straightforward message. It was a series of apparently nonsensical numbers and words scribbled in a hasty hand. 87. River. 21. Iron. 44. Light. Cinders. Unit 1B. 19-3-42. Not metal. Wait for the bell. It was a coded message. The numbers looked like dates or coordinates, the words like random nouns. Yet Eleanor's mind, trained to find patterns in ledgers and blueprints, recognized the structure. It was too specific to be chance. It was a prearranged, simple substitution.
"The ventilation shaft," June murmured, glancing at the dust-covered ceiling. "It runs directly from Bay 4 into 1B, used to move light tools." It was an insane plan. The shafts were narrow, dark, and filled with sharp ducts, but it was their only way to bypass the armed guards. At precisely midnight, when the second shift change of the night provided a chaotic distraction at the main gates, the three women made their move. Eleanor used a small, magnetized toolkit, smuggled from the discarded engineering supplies, to disable the lock on the maintenance access panel behind a towering stack of crates. Maria, surprisingly agile, led the ascent. Her smaller frame navigated the claustrophobic space with fierce determination. June followed, her steady strength pushing the crates back into place, sealing their entrance. Eleanor, the last one in, prayed the noise of the machines would drown out the scraping of their boots against the metal ducts. They moved like shadows through the echoing darkness, the air thick with dust and the thrum of the factory's hidden heart. Finally, they reached the vent opening into Unit 1B. Below them, the massive, completed assembly, the culmination of the classified program, loomed under spotlights, ready for transport. A single figure, a maintenance man they had seen occasionally in Bay 4, was standing near the coolant tanks. They had found their saboteur, and the clock strikes midnight was the signal for their desperate race to save the factory and the war effort itself. Their midnight infiltration had been a terrifying success, but it came at a high cost. As they witnessed the maintenance worker, a man named Mr. Finch, the very engineer who introduced Assembly Team Alpha, tampering with the coolant tanks, Maria acted instinctively. She dropped her small metal flask onto the concrete floor to create a loud, distracting clang. The saboteur bolted, but not before Maria managed to grab a discarded chemical vial as evidence. They escaped back through the ventilation shaft, but the alarm was sounded. Mr. Thorne, already suspicious of Eleanor's team, found the open maintenance panel and immediately pinpointed the women as the source of the breach. The following morning, before the 6 a.m. shipment could roll out, the three women were separated and dragged to the security wing. Eleanor was taken first, then June, but when the guards came for the third, Mr. Thorne had already made his decision. It was Maria who was led into the suffocating, windowless room, bathed in the cruel, focused light of a single bare bulb, the interrogation room's glare. Thorne sat across the steel table, his face a mask of triumph and icy accusation. Beside him was a stern man in a dark federal uniform. "Maria Rodriguez," Thorne began, his voice low and contemptuous. "We found this. Explanations?" He slammed a small, heavy object onto the table, Maria's sepia-toned photograph of her Japanese-American grandparents, retrieved from her locker after the raid. "Relocation, you called it."
Thorne scoffed, but Eleanor continued. "Finch thinks he's safe because the evidence is gone, but he doesn't know about the Whisper Network. If he truly believes Maria is about to confess, he will try to destroy any final loose ends before his own escape." The agent remained skeptical. "How do you propose we prove this?" "We don't prove it, we lure him," Eleanor countered. "Tell Finch, loud enough for him to hear, that Maria has broken and is naming an accomplice who gave her the vial. Tell him the name is Unit 9X, a reference to a part only he knows was flawed." The federal agent hesitated, but the promise of an immediate capture instead of a long, messy interrogation was appealing. Thorne, furious at Eleanor's arrogance, was momentarily sidelined. Back in her holding cell, Eleanor and June enacted the second part of their desperate, unsanctioned action. June used the small hidden file she'd kept for sharpening her tools to scrape open a ventilation grill. Then, using her knowledge of the building's old pneumatic system, she managed to bang a sequence of sharp raps on the ductwork that, to any savvy factory worker, sounded like a burst water pipe in a remote area, the kind of emergency that would draw maintenance to the far side of the factory. The bait was set. Thorne's men were occupied with the false emergency. Finch, overhearing the confession from Maria's interrogation room, would believe his cover was blown and that his key accomplice was about to be revealed. He would rush to destroy the last loose end, the only person who truly knew his full plan. Eleanor listened, her heart pounding. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Not Thorne's slow, deliberate stride, but a swift, panicked run. The footsteps stopped right outside the interrogation room where Maria was held. The door creaked open, then a sharp, strangled cry. Finch had taken the bait. He had come to silence Maria and lure the real culprit out of the shadows. Eleanor, risking everything, screamed, "He's here! Finch is the saboteur!" The ensuing crash of bodies and the shouts of the federal agent confirmed the success of her audacious gamble. The sudden burst of action, Maria's struggle, Eleanor's scream, and the swift intervention of the federal agent erupted into a violent skirmish. Mr. Wallace Thorne, momentarily stunned, watched his meticulously controlled investigation shatter as Mr. Finch fought desperately, his lab coat tearing as he tried to disarm the agent. The truth, revealed in that moment of panicked violence, was devastatingly mundane and yet profoundly sinister. Finch, the seemingly loyal, mild-mannered engineer who had brought Eleanor, Maria, and June onto the classified project, was the spy. He was subdued quickly, his face contorted not with the steely defiance of a professional operative, but the bitter, trembling rage of a fanatic cornered. In the quiet, with Finch cuffed and Maria finally released from her chains, the federal agent, now fully in charge, demanded answers. "Why?" the agent barked, thrusting the corrosive chemical vial at Finch. "Who are you working for? Berlin? Tokyo?" Finch spat on the floor. "You think this is about flags?" he sneered, his voice thin and sharp with conviction. "It's about the machine, the military-industrial complex that feeds on war and keeps us slaves to oil and steel."
Everything you saw, everything you heard, and everything you did here today, it never happened, the agent said, his voice hard as stone. Mr. Finch was transferred for medical reasons. The breach was a minor procedural error. The true nature of this project and your role in saving it falls under the silence of the classified. The document they were made to sign was permanent. It bound them to secrecy for life, threatening severe prison time for even hinting at the events or the existence of the technology they built. Their courage was not to be celebrated, it was to be buried. Their records sealed away in Washington's deepest archives. "You understand, ladies," Thorne interjected, his voice regaining its usual menace. "If anyone asks, you simply worked your shift. You saw nothing unusual. You are not heroes. You are loyal employees." Eleanor felt a wave of profound anticlimax. Their risk, their teamwork, and their victory were already being scrubbed from history. They had saved the American war effort only to be swallowed by the anonymity of the war machine itself. Later that evening, back on the night shift, the three women stood together by the punch clock, waiting for the bell. The factory was cleaned, the atmosphere was tense, but the immediate fear was gone. "So that's it," June said quietly, adjusting her coveralls. "We saved the world, and we can never tell anyone." Maria managed a slight ironic smile. "We know, and we know we did it together. That is enough." Eleanor looked at her friends. The factory could erase the records and enforce the silence, but it couldn't erase the bond forged in the heat of the hidden bay. They were sworn to secrecy about their heroism, but they carried the proof in the resilience of their spirits. They were the unseen architects of victory, and their true story would only ever live in the silent, knowing glances they shared across the noisy factory floor. The war ended not with the sound of a celebratory factory whistle at Redwood, but with a sudden, eerie silence. The massive complex, the heart of the classified project, was shuttered almost overnight. Eleanor, Maria, and June were given severance papers and sent back to their respective corners of America, their wartime experiences dissolving back into the fabric of the nation's untold history. The years rolled on, decades passing like frames of a quickly aging film. Eleanor returned to Waverly Creek, married a man who never asked too many questions about her time away, and raised 2 children. She became the meticulous manager of the local library, her wartime precision now applied to organizing Dewey Decimals. The secret of Unit 117B lay buried deep, untouched by time, covered by layers of suburban peace. Maria, her family finally released from the internment camps, moved to California and became a respected science teacher, her sharp technical mind inspiring generations of students. June, utilizing the practical skills honed in the factory, went to college and eventually became an architect.
designing functional, elegant structures